So welcome everyone to our second First Fridays of the season. This is the First Friday speaker series from First Presbyterian Church in Mankato, Minnesota. We're so happy that you have joined us. We would love to hear where you're joining us from. Feel free to put in the chat where you are watching from. We have a local audience as well as a national audience, including our speaker, Ciaran, who's coming to us from, well, he's from New York, but he's in Rhode Island right now, I believe. So for those of you who aren't already aware, First Fridays is a speaker series where we bring in speakers about a variety of topics every month and who speak about all kinds of issues and how we can respond faithfully to them. So what is more on our brains right now than the upcoming election? And we thought, what a great way to think about the election and how we can communicate with others about it than bringing in Braver Angels. Braver Angels is a nonprofit dedicated to helping people communicate across the aisle and communicate with people that they disagree with. So I have been somewhat jokingly, but really in all seriousness, calling this our how to handle Thanksgiving or how to approach an awkward Thanksgiving workshop. So we're really excited to bring in Ciaran O'Connor. He is the Chief Marketing Officer. I knew there was some official sounding title to that, with Braver Angels out of New York City. He has spoken on any number of platforms, including TED Talks and podcasts. He's the host of the Braver Angels podcast, and he is here to introduce us to this topic, to help us work through how to communicate with a variety of people and how to get involved with Braver Angels as they move a variety of initiatives forward. So I'm going to shoot it over to you, Ciaran. One last thing before I forget is if you have any questions or comments throughout the speaker today, be sure to post your questions in the chat. I will be able to see them as the host, and I can ask them during the Q&A portion at the end. We'll also open that up later for anyone who wants to turn off or turn on their mic and ask questions as well. But be sure to type in any thoughts you have. We want to make this a really fun, interactive experience too. So, all right, Ciaran, now I'm going to you. So let's shoot it over. There you are.
Thank you. Thank you, Bailey, and thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to all of you guys for coming and welcoming me here today to talk about where we are as a country and where we're going and how we can work together to try to bridge the political divide and ultimately to try to hold America together. I'll talk a little bit about my personal story, why I got involved in this work. I'll talk about Braver Angels, our story, how we got started after the 2016 election and how we've grown into this national citizens movement of liberals and conservatives working together, people who believe that it's important to work across the divide and to do so in a way that doesn't require you to moderate your positions or compromise your values, but does call upon us to try to see the humanity and dignity and worth in people who disagree with us and with whom we may have strong and deeply painful disagreements, with the recognition that we still are one country and we'd like to keep it that way if we can. So I'll talk about all of that. I'll talk about the problem of polarization, some of the potential antidotes and solutions we've developed in our methods. And then I'll also open up the floor because I'd love to hear from you all about why you came here today. Why are you concerned about political division and what do you hope that you can do about it? And then also just take questions on my remarks today, because I'm sure you guys might have questions and want to know more about specific aspects. And then maybe just end on potential next steps if you want to get more involved with Braver Angels. Because as I mentioned, we are really a bottom-up, decentralized, volunteer-driven movement. We basically count on Americans who feel a duty civic duty to try to push back against the forces of polarization and find ways to bring people together. And we are actually super active in Minnesota, I'm pleased to say. Minneapolis is one of our, key hotspots. And so there's definitely a lot of opportunities for you guys to engage locally. Although now, of course, a lot of that, the discussions will be happening on Zoom as well. So first, I can tell you a little bit about myself, my story, and why I've gotten involved in this work. I grew up in New York City. Both my parents are journalists and tend to lean pretty liberal. The vast majority of my friends growing up were liberal. I went to a fairly liberal university. When I graduated college, I went to work on the 2012 Obama campaign, which was my first job. And in some ways was kind of the zenith of my political experience, because as a 21-year-old, I was able to help Barack Obama, a man that I deeply believed in, win re-election. And my reaction there was, wow, politics is awesome. It's so inspiring. Like, this is what I want to do as a career. And little did I know how the political landscape would evolve since that time. So I worked on the Obama campaign. I got involved in Democratic politics. In 2016, I worked on the Clinton campaign, working as a digital strategist and a communication strategist in campaign headquarters. And working on the Clinton campaign was a fantastic experience for me until the ending, when, frankly, I, as a Democrat, as a liberal, as a blue, as we like to call them in Braver Angels, I was devastated, and I was left with a feeling that I didn't quite understand my country. And I was someone who'd always prided myself on valuing diversity. As I said, I grew up in New York City, so I took the subway to school, surrounded by people of all backgrounds, all walks of life, black, white, rich, poor. But after the 2016 election, I said, well, I don't actually have too many relationships with people who voted for Trump or people who are deeply conservative. And while I still really believed in, opposing Trump when it comes to his policies as a Democrat, I was also concerned about this deeper problem of polarization growing to the point that, it's the belief that my political opponent is not just wrong or misguided, but they're, a fundamentally bad person, that they're a threat to me and my family. And I was seeing this political division increase, not just in the news, not just in politics, but in communities, at the workplace, in families. We have a lot of people who've been drawn to Braver Angels because politics has been really ripping apart close, intimate relationships. And people want to maintain those relationships with loved ones. But they don't know how. They don't know what to do when politics comes up. So I basically got involved with Braver Angels after 2016 because I wanted to do something that could address this kind of larger underlying problem that's not going to go away, regardless of who wins. And I got involved with Braver Angels when it was sort of little more than an idea. The idea was, could we bring together folks who'd voted for Trump and folks who'd voted for Clinton? Could we bring them together in a constructive way, in a way that would lead to more understanding and not necessarily just more demonization? And so we said, well, how can we do that? And we actually drew upon the practices of family therapy, in particular, couples therapy. And so our original Red Blue workshop, it was designed by a guy named Bill Doherty, who's actually at the University of Minnesota. He's a longtime family therapist, and he actually specializes in working with couples who are on the brink of divorce and who basically want to make a last effort to try to save their marriage. And in some ways, I think, America is on the brink of a civic divorce. And so Bill basically designed this red-blue workshop according to practices that he'd seen work in couples therapy. And so the goal of the workshop is to try to build understanding, to try to clarify disagreements, to illuminate common values where they do exist, but do so in a way where people are not trying to change the other person's mind. So it's not a traditional political debate, where you're coming with your talking points and where people tend to be argumentative and defensive off the bat. It's really about giving people an opportunity to better understand another person's perspective in their own words. So the goal is not to get people to agree. It's not, let's make everyone a centrist. Let's, meet in the mushy middle, or try to, paper over our disagreements, or, kind of fetishize centrist compromise. It's about building relationships and growing understanding and trust. It's about building trust. Because when you can do that, that's when you actually can find ways to work together, and work to strengthen relationships. Even if you disagree with someone on 90% of issues, if you have a relationship and you have trust, and you have a structure and a method and an approach for a conversation, the results can really be inspiring and encouraging and transformative. And that obviously stands in sharp contrast to so much of what we see today. Because it's easy to read the news and, to have lost friends and have strained family relationships and just get really pessimistic. And I think there's a lot of fear and anxiety right now that the country could really split apart. It's been a tough year, and it seems like our social fabric is disintegrating, and we're obviously coming up on an election that could produce a constitutional crisis. There could be a contested election, and an election in which, regardless of who wins, you could have one side really angry at the other, and accusing them of destroying our democracy or stealing the election. And that's obviously the current context in which Braver Angels is operating. And I'll talk a little bit about our specific plans to deal with the election in the next 30 days and afterwards. But right now I'll just return to the story of Braver Angels, because it's kind of the story of what you can do when you turn an idea into a movement. So we developed this initial idea for a red-blue workshop drawn on the practices of family therapy. We did a couple workshops in Southwest Ohio, in a working class area that was pretty evenly divided between liberals and conservatives. So we had these 2 weekend-long workshops with a series of exercises, moderated exercises, that were designed, again, to bring people together, increase understanding, foster trust, clarify disagreements, and build relationships. And we found they were actually pretty successful. We found that while people came in with their guard up and oftentimes resentful and full of suspicion, by the end of the weekend, a lot of them found out that they actually kind of liked each other. And even if they didn't like each other, they had a better understanding of different perspectives, and were able to see that, people can have sharp disagreements but still be acting in good faith. Not everyone who disagrees with you is ill-intentioned. So out of that workshop came the first Braver Angels Alliance. At that time, however, we were called Better Angels. We were named after the famous Lincoln phrase, "Better angels of our nature," which was a phrase that came out of his 1861 inaugural address when he took office, leading a country that was on the brink of the Civil War. And it's the idea that, we all have angels within us. It's not necessarily external angels to guide us, but we all have the better angels of our own nature. And we can call forth the better angels of our nature. It's very difficult, but it is possible. And it is, in Lincoln's telling, an American identity. And so we were kind of drawing on the legacy of Lincoln, and that's from whence our name original name, Better Angels, came. We are now Braver Angels. I'll talk a little bit about why that name changed, but essentially it's a newfound emphasis on courage and bravery. And that's because right now, having these conversations and crossing the political divide, it really is an act of courage. It's not just about empathy and respect and compassion and civility, although all of those things are important and values that we seek to cultivate, but it also really requires strength and courage. Not just the courage to withstand the insults and invective that you may receive from, the other side, but also the courage to, withstand the judgment from folks on your own side, who might accuse you of, fraternizing with the enemy or compromising your values. And so that's why Better Angels has become Braver Angels. Although, in fairness, I will say that we also did have a minor legal dispute with another organization called Better Angels. And so that had something to do with it too, but we were able to make lemonade out of lemons, and we feel like Braver Angels is actually a more suitable name for the current environment. So the first Braver Angels Alliance came out of the first Braver Angels Red Blue Workshop. A Braver Angels Alliance is essentially a group of a roughly even number of reds and blues, as we call them. Reds would be folks who lean conservative, tend to support Trump, vote Republican. Blues would be the opposite. And essentially, it's a group in a community that continues to meet together in an ongoing basis in the spirit of Braver Angels. And spread the word, start planning more workshops. Basically, we did those first 2 workshops. They were successful. We were able to raise a little bit of money to rent a bus. And we did a 3-week bus tour in the summer of 2017, where we went to 10 states around the country, doing workshops, hosting workshops, and planting the seeds for what would become a movement, a citizens movement that now has alliances in all 50 states. We've expanded our programming beyond just the Red Blue Workshop. The Red Blue Workshop is basically, a group of about 6 to 8 liberals and 6 to 8 conservatives who will come together for a day-long moderated workshop. And that's really kind of the initial meat and potatoes of Braver Angels. But we've expanded our programming to offer all kinds of different formats for this sort of engagement. So we have workshops that are specifically dedicated to absorbing practical skills, the skills that you can use at Thanksgiving. What do you do when politics comes up at the table? How do you navigate this? And how do you navigate it if your goal is to maintain and strengthen relationships? Because I think people have been conditioned now to view political conversations as sort of like zero-sum cage matches in which, it's dominate or submit. And I think people are taking cues from, what's on TV, what's on Twitter, and all of that. But we try to show people the power of coming to a political conversation where your goal is not to persuade or convince, but to actually understand and communicate. And so understand where someone else is coming from, make clear to them where you're coming from, and that's it. You're not trying to get them to come to your side. And if you do that, if you give people a good faith chance to talk about why they believe what they believe, they will often soften up, and you start to lose a little bit of that reflexive, defensiveness that people get when politics comes up. So we have skills workshops. We have depolarizing within workshops, which is where you sort of look inwards and assess your own feelings toward people who disagree with you politically. I mean, there's a whole spectrum from, respect and appreciation to pity to disdain to hatred, and thinking through, where do I really fall on that spectrum, and is that something that I want to change, or is that something I'm comfortable with? because there's a lot of people right now who are not interested in depolarization. They think it's a time to fight, and we can deal with putting our country back together later. And that's a perspective that I understand. But I think it's short-sighted and self-defeating. We believe that you can do both. That you can be a vigorous partisan and fight for your side, and that's what we need. I mean, democracy is a competition, and competition's good. And we are in an election season. Elections have consequences. We encourage our members, red and blue, to be active in their local parties, to be, organizing. But at the same time, we think there's like a higher partisanship, a higher patriotism, that leads people to the work that we do. So we expanded our programming. We launched a series of debates. We have Braver Angels debates, where we essentially bring our approach to specific hot button issues. So we give people a chance to really debate the really touchy subjects, whether that's abortion or climate change or gun rights, or the Electoral College or voting rights. And we've really seen that program in particular resonate this year, again, because people are in a fighting mood, and we want to meet them where we are. And we want to give them an opportunity to have these conversations in a constructive way, where it's not about winning. It's not about beating someone in a debate. It's really about a shared pursuit of truth and an opportunity to better understand perspectives of those with whom you disagree. And as you do so, you actually can end up persuading people. But the first step really is about understanding and the articulation of your own views in a way that it can be received in a legitimate fashion. So we have all of these programs available. Obviously, we had to evolve our approach with the pandemic, because prior to March, so much of our work had been predicated on, face-to-face, citizen-to-citizen depolarization. And obviously, there are certain things you lose. You're doing it on Zoom, and you're trying to break down barriers. People don't get necessarily that body language or connection, or they can't, break bread after the workshop. So we had to think about how could we leverage technology to do this same work, and found that it actually does have certain advantages. We've been able to do Braver Angels debates where we have 1,500, 2,000 people participating, and we'll bring them on in Zoom, and then put them in separate breakout rooms. And it's actually helped us scale our work in some ways, because people are actually at home right now, isolated, looking for things to do, looking for ways to connect. And obviously committing to being on Zoom for 2 hours is in some ways a lighter lift than, committing to going to an in-person 3-hour workshop. So we have a range of activities available. Some of them are national, run by our staff, which is kind of small and mighty, but most of them are run by volunteers. We have over 1,000 active volunteers nationwide, who are running workshops in their own community. As I mentioned, we're pretty active in Minnesota, and we have various alliances in Minnesota. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the programming we offer. As Bailey mentioned, we also have a media arm of our work, because, one thing we hear in workshops from both Republicans and Democrats, one of the points of agreement is that the media is serving to divide us further. And we wanted to provide media that can exist as an alternative to the partisan media complex, and try to model what constructive cross-partisan discourse can look like. And in some ways, it produces a lot more interesting content. It's like if you bring a liberal and a conservative together, rather than just being like, okay, debate Trump and Russia, if you actually give them each 5 minutes to talk about, like, why are you a liberal? Why are you a conservative? What are the values that make you think your side is right for America? But also ask them, what are the reservations that you have about your own side? That naturally ends up producing kind of a deeper conversation. And again, one that's not going to necessarily lead to agreement, but it will lead to kind of a richer and deeper understanding. And people generally leave those conversations feeling more hopeful and empowered about what they can do and what the country might be capable of if we can really spread this work. I guess the last two things I'll talk about before I open it up, because I really want to dedicate at least half of this time to conversation with you all and questions, is the context of where we are right now as a country. Obviously, polarization has continued to increase. I don't need to tell you guys that. I think you all feel it in your conversations and your relationships and the media that you're digesting. But I looked up a couple of statistics that I think are, shed some quantitative light on the problem. In 1960, pollsters asked Americans whether they'd have a problem if their son or daughter married someone of the opposite party. In 1960, it was 5%. Today, that number is well over 50%. 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats now agree that the country would be better off if a large number of opposing partisans just died. And then most recently, Politico put out a poll on Wednesday in which they assessed Americans' openness to political violence. Essentially, how much do you feel it is justified for your party to use violence in advancing political goals? And in 2017, it was 8% of Democrats and 8% of Republicans who said that violence would be acceptable. On September 1st, 2020, it was 33% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans polled who said that violence would be acceptable. So it's pretty scary stuff where we are in a country, and obviously, I think a lot of Americans are fearful of what could happen after the election, particularly if there's a legitimacy crisis. And so Braver Angels is really focused on inviting Americans to come together to try to hold America together, regardless of who you support. So we're going to be putting out a public letter next week. It's called A Letter from America. And we're encouraging everyone to sign, regardless of their political affiliation. And it's essentially a statement of purpose, that we are Americans who plan to vote for Biden and Americans who plan to vote for Trump. But we also are committed to embracing a higher patriotism and to disavowing violence, those who would commit violent acts or make excuses for violence. And as part of this forthcoming Hold America Together campaign, we'll also be inviting people to organize Hold America Together gatherings in the wake of the election, in which people who voted differently can come together to process what happened and do it in a structured way. And then these gatherings can be composed of just people who agree with you, or just people who disagree with you. And we also have different templates for different scenarios. So, one in which we have a clear victor and a clear loser, and one in which there's an election in which our institutions cannot produce consensus on who is the legitimately elected president, which is a scenario, according to our most recent poll, that about half of Americans expect to happen, which is pretty striking in itself. So there's a lot more I could talk about with Braver Angels. It's really like a fascinating movement. We have 11,000 members nationwide. We have all sorts of different initiatives. We have all sorts of media, podcasts, videos. There's a real kind of deep intellectualism in our work too, that thinks about, what is this approach to transforming conflict? Some of it's based on a moral foundations theory, which looks at, what are the values that divide liberals and conservatives, and how can we think about that kind of stuff when we approach these conversations. So, before I ramble on any further, I'd say, you guys should definitely check out our website if you're interested in learning more about our approach, our story, our leadership, what it is that we actually do. The last thing I'll say is that we observe the Braver Angels rule. And the Braver Angels rule is that we are half red and half blue at every level of leadership, from our staff to our board of directors to our funding. We're half red and half blue. Granted, our membership is open to anyone, so we don't, control the breakdown of our membership, but we have found that it's really important to be legitimately bipartisan, because a lot of the groups that try to do this work end up leaning one way or the other, and I think it makes it difficult for them to kind of live out the values that they're trying to express. And obviously, we really are grassroots funded and grassroots led. So yeah, I'd love to open it up to questions from you all. But first, I'd love to ask you guys a question if any of you are willing to share. I'd love to hear, why did you decide to come to this discussion today? Why are you concerned about this issue? Why are you here? Why are you taking time to hear me babble on? So if anyone wants to share there, I'd love to hear from them.
And you should be able to unmute yourselves if you would like to hop in and answer Ciaran's question.
Don't be shy. I'm sure some of you have reasons why you're here, or any stories of your own experiences with political division.
My name is Roberta Jensen. I don't really have a story to share, but I have an increased frustration on Facebook trying to respond to people who don't share my political views, the same political views, how to respond to them without emotion, how to respond to them factually. And it's becoming I guess it's getting to the point where I just want to stay off Facebook because it gets me so upset. So we have had conversations in our book club numerous times. Most of us have the same views, but we all share the same frustration on not knowing how to talk to people about it. So your organization has come up in our book club conversations. So we were familiar with it, but then all of us decided we'd try and be part of this conversation today too. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you. And yeah, social media is a tricky one. I think it's one of the real driving forces of polarization. And while I think our skills for talking across the divide can be useful on social media, it's tough because, it's a lot easier to be cruel and dismissive when you're behind a computer screen than when you're looking someone in the face, even if you're looking someone in the face on Zoom. For sharing. Is there anyone else who wants to share why they are here today?
We had somebody type something in. Deb said, I wondered if I misunderstood my country after the 2016 election. And I wonder if I misunderstood my good friend of 20 years with whom I had so many things in common.
Yes. And I think that's a very common reaction. People are reevaluating their perspective of their country and their fellow countrymen. And then I guess the question is kind of where do we go from here? Thank you for that. Why don't we take one more person who wants to share why they came, and then we can open it up to any questions that you have for me.
I can speak. I feel like I'm lucky to know some people personally who have very different political views than I have. And I can think of one in particular who I like very, very much and find to be a wonderful person in many ways. So I have hope, but I also have fears when I hear some of the things that are being said in terms of what could happen in this country, particularly violence. But I do have hope that people can disagree, but respect one another. And because I believe I've seen that. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that's very much in line with how we think about things. And I encourage you, if you want to explore acting on that hope, to check out Braver Angels, and maybe participate in one of our debates, or even just read some of our content, because it might answer some questions and help you think about the issue more fully as we move toward the election. Again, we will be inviting people to sign up to organize these Hold America Together gatherings, and also releasing a public letter next week that we want to get everyone and their mother to sign. So you guys should all look out for that next week. We'll be putting it out on Facebook and email and stuff, and it's about 300 words. So we'll let people read the letter, and if it resonates with them, we'd love to have them sign, and then further their engagement with the Hold America Together campaign if they're interested in that. So yeah, I guess I'll open it up now. What questions do you guys have for me?
Ciaran, we have a couple that are kind of related, that are essentially just wondering, there's a lot of these workshops and so that you guys have done so much work. What, if any, of the highlights or the Spark Notes version of skills that people could take away from those workshops? What would some of those key skills be, or things to keep in mind when they come across somebody in person, somebody on social media that they disagree with, especially when it's somebody that, like many of our participants have been saying, is somebody that they're friends with, or that they care about, or thought they understood but are now being surprised about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me see if I can boil things down to skills that are practical and applicable. I guess I'd say the first thing to remember, or maybe the first expectation to abandon, is that you're going to be able to change someone's mind. So if someone says something that you disagree with, I think a lot of times the reaction is, well, let me make a counterpoint to change their mind. And if I can just make the right argument with the right facts and the right data, I'll be able to show them that they're wrong, and they'll see the light, and they'll come to my side. And it's not necessarily malicious or condescending. I think it's just easy to think like that, and we all do it. And again, that's how we're being conditioned to think about these conversations from cable news and social media, and what a lot of our political leaders are saying. So that's an important expectation to abandon if you want to have a more constructive conversation. And instead, go into the conversation with the goal of listening and learning, and also communicating. So giving someone else an opportunity to talk about what they feel, what they think, and to acknowledge that without trying to combat it. And then talk about how you see it. And obviously you may see things in a very divergent way. But instead of kind of combating what they say, you can just sort of talk about your own perspective. And some of you may be familiar with this, but we encourage people to use I statements rather than truth statements. So talk about how what you think about something, what you feel about something, rather than kind of saying this is the way it is. because you can't really invalidate someone else's lived experience the way that you can, invalidate a talking point. So what generally breaks through and resonates with people is when people talk about their own experiences that have led them to a particular political position, rather than trying to make like a reasonable or lawyerly argument. Talk about, here's how I arrived at that. Here are the experiences I've had that have shaped my worldview, or here's how this made me feel, when a certain politician said something. Because that can be a lot more powerful than trying to kind of paint them in a corner, or try to force them to defend a certain politician's actions. Because again, I think we're so accustomed to kind of asking gotcha questions, right? So like, if you're a liberal and you're talking to a Trump supporter, pointing out something he said and saying like, how could you support that? That's kind of the wrong approach. If your goal is to build a constructive relationship, because the other person is immediately going to get defensive, and feel like you're trying to make them out to be a bad person, or someone who doesn't care about other people, or whatever else it is. And the last thing I'd say is that, don't ascribe like a certain politician's positions or behavior to like everyone who supports that politician. I think that's something people do. And obviously that just comes back to like the stereotyping that we all naturally do. But the more you have these conversations, the more you kind of explore different perspectives, the more you can understand that, groups of people who share a political perspective are not monolithic. And a lot of times there's a lot more nuance and uncertainty. But if you go into the conversation hot, it's going to polarize really quickly, and it becomes really tribal, because I think people's politics is increasingly tied to their identity and really like their sense of self. And so when people feel like their politics are being attacked or criticized, people feel like their own identity is being questioned or demeaned, and it gets really tribal. And it's it's human nature to be tribal in some ways. But I think right now a lot of our political tribes are really organized based on what they're against, and obviously having a common enemy is a powerful motivator. But we have to think about, do we want to perceive our fellow Americans as enemies? Because ultimately, enemies is, leads to war and leads to violence. I mean, an enemy is someone who needs to be defeated. Whereas, a fellow citizen with whom you have strong disagreements, that's someone that you can hopefully work with, and ideally reconcile with. But it's hard work, and, it can wear you down, because you have to make yourself vulnerable, and you have to be willing to not have your approach be reciprocated, which can kind of sometimes make you just want to give up, which is understandable. It kind of comes back to, I think, the spirit of nonviolence, which really requires courage, and I think in some ways aligns with some of the teachings of various religions that privilege humility and mercy and grace and forgiveness and loving your neighbor, even when you feel like your neighbor might do you harm, or at least support a certain politician who you think is doing you harm. So hopefully that's helpful. Again, I would direct folks to our website to check out the resources. It's a bit of a jumble, but if you poke around, you can definitely find different resources. And our YouTube channel is a great resource because we have all kinds of videos, and we actually have videos of workshops. So if you want to sit and watch a workshop, you can. Granted, that's kind of long, but we also have shorter videos that kind of condense some of the content as well.
Ciaran, we have another question, or a few questions kind of related about conspiracy theories and communicating with people who aren't necessarily accepting of facts, and how to communicate when you're on different levels of accepting what reality looks like. So what are some ways that we can communicate with folks who are just have an entirely different belief about what is true? And with that, you know, when you see that sort of thing, or someone says that sort of thing, is it better to address it, to question it, you know, either in person or on Facebook, or is it better to move on to something else? And what phrases or tools would you use to communicate in that type of situation?
Totally. I think it depends on the situation, but in any situation, I think this is a real challenge. And I think this is one of the real dynamics that has deepened polarization. And I think it's a function of two things. One, I think there's sort of overall declining trust in, you know, what you might call mediating institutions or common sources of truth. You know, so in the past where, you know, there were like big media outlets, like the 3 broadcast outlets, people generally had more of like a shared sense of reality, you could call it. But now the media environment is so balkanized and fragmented and tribal that, you know, people are operating under completely different senses of what is true. You know, a lot of times these media outlets are driven by profit. They're driven by clicks. You know, and social science research tells us that, you know, what drives engagement a lot of times is negative emotion. So like if you see a really outrageous headline, or a, you know, headline that there's this grand conspiracy aligned, you're probably going to want to click on that. And then you click on it and you kind of fall into the wormhole, and then, you know, Facebook's algorithm ends up serving you more and more content that kind of just reinforces all these biases. It's basic confirmation bias. And when your bias is being shaped by disreputable news sources or partisan news sources that have like an agenda to try to push conspiracy theories, it gets really baked in, and it plays into a sense of paranoia that I think is being driven by all sorts of larger forces. I think, you know, with social media, communities are becoming more fragmented. I think people have less sources of community and meaning in their lives, so they're more vulnerable to this kind of thing. I think people are spending a lot more time on Facebook. And so it is really challenging. I would say that, you know, everyone can produce their own facts as they see them. And that's not to say that, you know, objective reality doesn't exist, because it does. But I'd say it's hard to make that sort of your first avenue of engagement, to just completely challenge someone else's fact or say, you know, that's wrong, that's a conspiracy. Like, here are my facts, you know, here's my story in the New York Times that shows why your story is completely wrong. I think it kind of comes back to the trust issue. If off the bat someone doesn't trust you, they're not going to trust your news source. So I think it's better to start with trying to understand where they're coming from, and build a relationship and trust, where then you can sort of share, you know, well, here's some of the information that's shaping my perspective. And I mean, ultimately, again, like, you know, it's very hard to change someone's mind, or show them that they're wrong. But over time, you know, as you build a relationship, that's kind of what then begins to build the bonds of trust and community that you can once again create a shared reality. But certainly, you know, the headwinds are pretty stiff on that one. particularly when it comes, I think, to cable news. If you're spending every night watching Fox or MSNBC or whatever else, and I'm not making a value judgment or trying to say one outlet is the same as the other or worse or better. But if you're watching something that has a vested interest in really pushing a partisan agenda and making the facts conform to that agenda, it can really drive your worldview, and it can really be quite poisonous. But I'd say, like, getting into a dispute on Facebook in the comments about, facts, generally counterproductive in my experience. I think if you're able to build a relationship, have more conversations, and I think over time you can start to, talk about different sources and kind of investigate together in a more trustful manner what is true. But I think that's one of the big issues for people is they're like, I can't talk to this person. Like, they think crazy stuff, and you know what I mean? So it requires patience and empathy. Yeah.
Thank you, Ciaran. Another question kind of related is thinking back to the idea of using couples counseling tools, which a lot of people are finding very interesting, that's what a lot of Braver Angels workshops are based on. So, what are some of those tools that we can use, especially when somebody, like if we're trying to approach the conversation calmly, but the other person comes in hot, like you said, are there ways to get to influence or to encourage the other person to calm down or to come down to a similar level of creating that space and that relationship and empathy? Are there things to say or to not say to get them to be cooler than they maybe entered the conversation?
Yeah, totally. I guess I'd preface it by saying two things. One is it always depends on the situation and the relationship. And then the second is I'm not a therapist. And so I can speak to it from my own experience and things we found to be successful. But I think, if we had Bill on, he's kind of like the high priest of Braver Angels. He could definitely give you guys a better answer than I could. I guess the first thing, that's you want to ask yourself metaphorically is like, do I want to stay in this marriage? Do I want to stay in this relationship? Because it's fine to say no. And that's not to say that you should just say, screw you, I never want to talk to you, but it's fine to walk away from a conversation, to put distance between you and someone else to protect your own emotional well-being. That's fine. And that's like a choice you need to make. I think if you say like, this relationship is important to me, I do want to try to maintain this relationship, or I do want to try to save or repair this marriage, if you think about it like a marriage, then yeah, there are certain things you can do. I mean, I think if someone is really coming at you with like vitriol and insulting you, I think it's appropriate to try to walk away. You have to sort of gauge it. I think if they're coming in with a lot of passion and defensiveness, I think there are definitely ways to like diffuse the situation. I think one thing that's powerful is to try to like paraphrase what someone's saying to you. So if someone's coming in hot, if you can sort of just like calmly say like, okay, like what I'm hearing from you is this, because then you're kind of validating what the other person is saying, and you can kind of check with them like, so what I'm hearing from you is this, like, is that right? And then the other person can kind of say like, yes, that's exactly right. Or they can say, no, like, you're twisting my words, what I mean is this. So I think that can be kind of a nifty trick to try to kind of paraphrase it, because then you're kind of like ensuring the other person feels heard. And I think a lot of times what drives the vitriol is they feel like they're not being heard. And that their perspective is not being listened to. Because again, I think there's a difference between like understanding a perspective and agreeing with it. Like, you don't have to agree with what they're saying or say like you're right, but just making clear that you really understand what they're saying. I think that can be a really powerful tool to diffuse the situation. Although sometimes people get annoyed if you're trying to like be like too like therapeutic. So you don't want to come off as like super condescending. So, it's a tricky balance. And I think it's also sometimes fine to just like not talk about politics. If you're at the Thanksgiving table and someone like really trying to talk about politics and you don't want to, I think you can also just say like, I understand, I'm happy to have that conversation, but I'd really not, I'd really rather not do it now. Or, if you think it's worthwhile, then you can kind of pursue it. But again, you have to be clear about your goal, is not to have a debate where you're trying to win or you're trying to humiliate the other person. Because if that's how it's going to be, then it's just going to make likely both people leave even more polarized than when they came in.
Thank you, Ciaran. So I do want to just say it is 1 o'clock. Anyone is welcome to get on with your day and do whatever else you need to do. But because we did get a little bit of a late start, I want to make sure that we have time for people to ask any questions that they have. So if anyone else has questions or comments or wants to hop in by unmuting yourself, and I think I've hit on most of the comments here. I'm just looking here. So Eric says not being heard is definitely a factor in fueling extremist conspiracy theories. So that seems to be a common theme here, is people communicating with people who have conspiracy theory beliefs. So anyone else who has questions, feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand or something, and then I can find your video. And Ciaran would be happy to answer those for you.
I have a question about messaging. Can you hear me?
Thanks. Yep. Thanks,
Yes,
Ciaran.
sure.
Okay. And I had put this in, so I'm gonna just kind of read what I wrote. Question about messaging about sides, and how can we meet people where they're at with an overall message of we're really in this together. And whether you're thinking about the pandemic, the election, changes in weather, and the other part of that for me is like some people might be liberal on some issues, conservative on others, and like it isn't like either or, but the messaging sounds like it is to me anyway, and that sometimes people change, including me, or modify beliefs as other things happen. So my question's about messaging. Thanks.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's a really good question. I think that it's very true that people, it's not monolithic. And I think it's really important to recognize that, people believe all sorts of different and even sometimes contradictory things. And so to try to say that someone is just a blue or just a red is oftentimes like a gross simplification. And I think one things that these conversations do is they actually better sort of illuminate the richness and range of nuance and help people clarify, well, where do we disagree? And wow, okay, actually, like a lot of times from the workshop, people's reaction is, oh, we actually like agree on more than I thought I did. Or at least even if, we both want to get to the same place, even if we disagree about how to get there. Or the question that we ask about, asking people to reflect on their reservations about, their own side, I think is powerful, because it shows that, people actually are thinking kind of critically and comprehensively about politicians they support. At the same time, I think we recognize that for better or worse right now, and especially in the current culture and discourse and politics, it really is a binary. I mean, the division right now is red or blue. And I think part of the issue is that a lot of people feel like even if they're sort of in the middle or they're, liberal on one thing and conservative on the other, right now, part of the polarization is people are sort of pushed to one side or the other, particularly when it comes to Donald Trump, because he is so polarizing. And so I think operating that environment, we're sort of presupposing the polarity that already does exist. and using that acknowledgement as a way to kind of get people in the door. And then once you do that, it becomes easier to sort of do exactly what you said. But it definitely is something we've struggled with, because sometimes we've had people say, you know, I'm an independent. I don't classify as a red or blue. Like, how do I fit into this? And so while the red blue workshop, which is what we're started with, does have a pretty clear separation, most of our other programs actually don't require you to, you know, choose a side. And in our debates, for example, we'll have like a one question. So for example, we're having a debate next Thursday, and the thing people will be debating is whether or not to re-elect Trump. For that, people, you know, will pick a side. But you don't necessarily have to be red or blue to choose a side on an issue, particularly if it's an issue like, you know, climate change. Like, you could have a lot of conservatives who might go a different way, or liberals who go a different way. And in the debates, we actually encourage, you know, if you want to change your mind, you can. So sometimes there are people who will give a speech in the affirmative at the beginning of the debate, and then by the end of the debate, will actually say, well, based on what I've heard, I'd actually like to make a different speech. So yeah, in a lot of our programming and messaging, we're trying to be more welcoming, but we also do want to try to acknowledge the world as it is, and try to reflect the tribalism that people do feel.
Thank you, Ciaran. We have Eric has his virtual hand raised. So Eric, do you have a question?
Question or an observation? I was thinking, I have family members that are politically far apart from me, and I have people that I encounter day to day, across the alley, at my job, anything like that. But I usually know how to deal with that. You know, I know they know my politics, I know their politics, and we kind of josh around about it, and we back away before it gets too much. It's the people that I agree with that I have trouble communicating with. It's the people, you know, you talked about being working for Secretary Clinton in the last presidential election, and I worked for Bernie Sanders, and I felt quite passionate about it. But what frightened me was how quickly it became a blood sport between the sides, that people wanted to demonize. You know, I was automatically a Bernie bro, and I was a sexist because I didn't support Secretary Clinton and all that. And none of that was true, and it made me defensive, and it made me angry, and all of a sudden I started believing things about the people that were supporting Clinton that weren't true either. And we weren't competing with each other because we were ostensibly on the same side. We were both, you know, we were both liberals. We were coming from the liberal side of the thing. This seems to come up again and again. And most recently, this militiaman, the 17-year-old that went from Illinois to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and shot the people. I was talking with somebody the day after that happened, and it was a guy that was very much in agreement with my politics and everything like that. And I says, you know, I can really see how that kid got in that situation, and it's very much like what I experienced when I went to Vietnam. I was a scared teenager who bought into a false mythology of what I was going to be doing when I picked up a gun and left my home, and then got into a dark and confusing situation where I panicked and pulled the trigger when I shouldn't have. You know, that's what this kid did. He's not a monster. He's not necessarily a Nazi. He's been indoctrinated in a bad way. You know, 17-year-olds, that's when people decide they're going to join the Marine Corps, and that's when other people decide they're going to go join ISIS. You know, that's you buy into conspiracy.
Yeah, no,
I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important question, and oftentimes sometimes the fiercest battles are actually like with people on our own side, quote unquote, because we're trying to define what our own side actually believes. So I think, yeah, like the Bernie Clinton divide definitely got super polarized and led to a lot of stereotyping, and definitely probably affected relationships as well. And then on the red side of things, I think, you know, even though I think according to polls, like the vast majority of Republicans are Trump supporters, there's still a really fierce divide between Trump supporters and then, you know, quote unquote, never Trumpers or conservatives who are opposed to Trump. That's actually in some ways kind of the fiercest divide of them all, because the current president is a Republican, and so he's sort of by definition in some ways the leader of the party. And so I think a lot of Trump supporters think that never Trumpers are like, you know, traitors or defectors, whereas never Trumpers think they're the real conservatives who are standing up to this guy who's, you know, orchestrated a hostile takeover of their party. So yeah, we recognize that, and we try to give blues or reds also the opportunity to have conversations just among themselves. So we actually have like a blue caucus and a red caucus. And I think I mentioned one of our workshops is called Depolarizing Within. And that one also places a pretty emphasis on how to think about, relating to people who are, you know, on our own quote unquote side. And also thinking about, you know, how can you, when you're with your own like-minded people, like how do you talk about people on the other side? Because I think a lot of the polarization like manifests, it's like you're a Democrat and you're talking with a bunch of other Democrats, and then the conversation turns to Trump supporters, and all of a sudden it's just like dripping with disdain. Or if, you know, you're a Trump supporter and you're with a bunch of other Trump supporters and you start talking about liberals, it just is really angry. And I think like the dominant emotion on the right toward the left is anger, but I think the dominant emotion on the left toward the right is contempt. And I think they're kind of different but related. And so we try to give people a way to, if they can, step in and try to be braver angels with their own tribe, and try to remind people of why we're doing this. And I mean, it's like I said, it's scary. You know, that poll I cited, basically over 30% of both Republicans and Democrats are saying that violence is at least a little bit justified. It's pretty significant percentages, but it's still a minority. I mean, you still have 70% or so of people on each side who don't want to see violence. And so I think it's worth reminding people of what the stakes are and sort of where the kind of logical conclusion of this sort of vitriolic and polarizing rhetoric is. Because ultimately, in some ways, it's sort of a fork between violence and conversation. And so I think, for those who don't want to see it go down the former path, you have to think about what's needed to go the conversation route.
Well, thank you, Eric, for your question. Thank you, everyone who joined in and participated today. Thanks especially to Ciaran for leading this, for taking time to speak to all of us and share about everything that Braver Angels has to offer. We will be sending out follow-up emails for all of you who are on our email list with links to other resources. I will put it on our Facebook page as well. So you can access all of that at facebook.com/FPC Mankato, as in facebook.com/First Presbyterian Church Mankato. So we'll make sure to get that to you. So Ciaran will be sending me links to a variety of resources so you can join in on future workshops that they have or anything else that interests you. And be sure to join us next month on November. Oh my gosh, I've totally forgot to even look at the date. What is it? November 6th. It's the first Friday of the month. And we will be shifting gears. We'll be talking to Mark Seeley, who is a meteorologist and climatologist. And he will be talking with us about climate change. So be sure to tune in for that as well. It will also be on Zoom. So watch your email, watch Facebook, and hopefully we'll see you then. Ciaran, any last words for everyone?
Yeah, well, I guess first I just want to express a note of gratitude to you, Bailey, and Lindsay, and all of you for coming. And then just, yeah, as Bailey mentioned, invite and encourage you guys to consider getting involved. We have lots of ways of getting involved, some of which are just, reading and sharing. Others is participating in an event, and then, deeper engagement, like signing up to get trained as a moderator or get trained as a debate chair, or sign up to organize one of these groups after the election. And if you do that, we're here to help. We have the structure and the template and all of that. So yeah. And yeah, lastly, we are a membership organization, so if you like what we do, please become a member. It's only $1 a month, so we keep it cheap for a reason. We want everyone to be able to join so that we really look like the country. So yeah, if you're interested, please consider becoming a member. If you're able, we consider a donation. We kind of rely on the generosity of our members. But really it's about getting involved and volunteering and helping spread the word. And obviously it's a critical time for the country. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ciaran. And again, thanks to everyone for joining. For more information about First Presbyterian Church or about First Fridays to stay in the loop, be sure to like and follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/FPC Mankato. And we hope to see you next month. Thanks so much for joining. Have a great weekend.